My name's Elizabeth Adams-Goins,
Spell it.
and it's Elizabeth, Adams, Adams, Goins, Goins.
And what is your middle name?
Violet, Violet.
Can you please explain your date and place of birth and whether you were born at home or in a hospital?
I was born at the time was 122 Vine Street, Zanesville, Ohio, and I was born at home.
Do you remember if your mother was attended by a midwife or a doctor?
She was attended by Dr. Bateman of Zanesville, and my aunt was there to take care of her.
Can you please tell me what is your ethnic or racial background?
Well, I don't really know. We have just always gone as colored.
Can you please tell me the name of your parents, where they were born, and what are their dates of birth, and any other interesting information that you'd like to tell us about them?
Okay, my mother was Ethel Mabel Stevens Adams, and she was born at Waterford, Ohio, and I believe just up the road a ways from the camp here. And my father was born in West Virginia, Elizabeth, I believe, West Virginia. And I don't know.
When were they born?
Okay. My mother, they both were born in 1894.
And how did your parents meet?
I really don't know that.
How'd your father get from West Virginia to Ohio?
Well, I think his parents moved to Morgan County, Ohio. And as long as I can remember, that is where they have lived, was Morgan County, Ohio.
And can you please tell me about his parents? Who were his parents?
His parents was James L. Adams and Martha Mayo Adams.
And do you know approximately when they were born?
You know, I cannot tell you.
Tell me a little bit about your mother's parents, their names, if you know where they're from, and their dates of birth.
I don't know their dates of birth, but my mother's father, Jethro Stevens, I think was born at Stockport, Ohio. And her mother was Eliza Jane Dalton. And I'm not sure whether she was born in Ohio or whether she was born in West Virginia.
Tell me a little bit about your brothers and sisters. Who are they when they were born? Where you fit in the lineup?
I only have one stepbrother, and he was about 8 years older than I am. He was born 1917 or 18, and
What was his name?
James Adams III.
And so, which one of your parents was married before?
My father.
And he was married, do you know who he was married to?
To Julia Morgan, and her parents' name was Martha Palmer and Lewis Morgan.
And what happened to her?
She passed away shortly after childbirth.
Tell me about who is your husband, if you know where he was born and his date of birth.
My husband is Donald O'Neill Goins, and he was born November the 12th, 1921 in Kalkaska, Michigan.
And how did you and your husband meet? And how old were you?
I was 16 when we married. And we both worked on West Main Street at a fruit market in Zanesville. That's where we met.
And what date did you get married? And describe your wedding a little bit.
We really didn't have a wedding. We went to Greenup, Kentucky and got married on April the 29th, 1942.
And why Greenup, Kentucky?
Well, because we could get married there, and our parents didn't know that we were going.
So why didn't you tell your parents that you were getting married?
Well, they just probably wouldn't have accepted it.
So you mentioned you got married when you were 16.
16.
What were you were you working? Were you in school? Were you doing
Well, I was in school and I'd done housework for a few hours after school. And at a fruit market, I worked on weekends.
So when you got married, who was in attendance? Was it just you and your husband?
And there was people there that would be the, what do I want to call them?
The witnesses?
The witnesses,
Your husband was the same age?
No, my husband was 19.
And so, why couldn't you get married in Ohio?
Because Ohio wouldn't marry you at that age, not at 16 without your consent of your parents.
Can you please tell me the names of your children, their dates of birth, and where they were born?
Donald Goins, our oldest son is Donald O'Neill Goins Jr. He was born in Zanesville, Ohio, April the 7th, 1944. And our middle son is David Eugene Goins. His birth date is February the 4th, 1948. He was born in Lansing, Michigan. And our daughter, Irita Ethel Goins, was born in 1949 at Zanesville, Ohio.
And were your children born at home or in a hospital?
In the hospital.
And you mentioned your husband was from Michigan. Do you know why he came to Ohio or to Zanesville?
His father done trucking business, and wherever he had work, that was where they lived. So he lived part of the time in Michigan, and wherever the work was for his parents, they moved back and forth.
After getting married, where did you live?
Where did we live?
Yeah.
Well, shortly, we lived with his parents for a while. Then he went in the service, like we were married in April. He went in the service in November, and he was in 3 years, a little over 3 years. And I was fortunate enough to be with him most of the time. He didn't have to go overseas. So we were in several different states.
What branch of the military was he in?
He was in the Air Force.
And what years did he serve in the Air Force?
Served from 42 to 45 through in November 45, I believe it was.
So this was during
World War II.
And can you explain a little bit what life was like during World War II for you and your husband?
Well, it was just like traveling from base to base as he was transferred from one base to the other. We would get room, then you got usually a room and had privileges of using the kitchen and the living area of the house. And there just wasn't really a whole lot to do. There was a few times I did get a job like at a drugstore or anything you could do to make a little extra money.
And can you please name some of the places where you lived when he was enlisted in the military?
Okay, the first place that I was to was Venice, Florida. And he went from Venice, Florida to Lakeland, Florida. He was transferred from Lakeland back to Venice. And then we went to San Antonio, Texas. We come back, I believe, in was Augusta, Georgia. And then to Charleston, South Carolina, where he was discharged.
Can you mention a little bit about what was like living in the South, coming from Ohio? How was it different for people of color in the South when you lived there?
Well, there was like riding on your bus or public transportation. You had to ride at the back of the bus, and in fact, there was a lot of times there were problems because my husband and I both were light, and the couple that we buddied with all the time were dark. So we used to, when we get on the bus, we would try to sit, like at the dividing line, we would sit in the seat right in front of him. And then, of course, we would visit back and forth with him while we were going from place to place. And there's been times that the bus would get crowded and the whites would get on and sit down in front of us. Or no, some of the ones that knew we were colored would sit down in front of us. And the bus driver would get very upset. He'd keep saying, all whites move to the front, all whites move to the front. And my husband used to tell him, go ahead, you drive your bus, we're where we belong. Until he'd just look up in the mirror and his face would get so red, you know, you could see the anger there. And so finally, my husband would say to the other couple we were with, he says, I think maybe we better get off at the next stop. It kind of looks like there may be trouble brewing. So we'd get off and, you know, we'd get close enough to where we could walk the rest of the way where we were going. But we never actually run into any trouble other than something like that.
Now you mentioned when he was stationed in the military, where would you live? Would you live on base or?
No, you would rent a room from, you know, a family near the base. And then, wait a minute, we were in Georgia too, I think, maybe I forgot to name that one. But when we lived there was a hotel there that they rented the rooms reasonable to the soldiers. And we lived there for a while, and then you had to eat out all the time. But we soon found us a place to where we could cook our own meals.
Now, were the places that you lived, were they segregated or integrated when he was living?
They were still segregated.
And how about, you said you had to eat out a lot. Was it easy to find places that served people of color when you were living?
Well, actually, there was a restaurant where we ate most of the time there at the hotel where we were at. And that was about, you know, the cheapest place. At that time, you didn't have a whole lot to spend. And so we used to eat there at the restaurant a lot.
What was the name of that hotel, if you recall?
You asked me too quick. It was just a local. I can't think of it now. Maybe I can tell you later.
Can you talk a little bit about your schooling? Where did you go to school? What was it like? Was it segregated or integrated, and activities you participated in school?
I started the school at Zanesville. And the schools there, they were integrated there at that time. And I think the kindergarten, I started there in the first grade. And I went to Waterford just 1 year because my father's job they had moved out of town and he didn't want to move to Gary, Indiana, so he decided to go to West Virginia and work in the coal mines. So we moved to West Virginia and we lived there from 1931 until 1939. And of course the schools there were segregated. And this town that we moved to, there were two schools there. There was a white school, and there, at that time called a colored school instead of a black school. And the children going to the black school were all darker children. The light colored children, their parents wouldn't send them to school with the darker children, so there was no school there. But my father said, my children are going to school, I don't care, you know, who they go to school with, they're going to school. So our family and one other light family had a daughter, and we both went to school there. And then the next year, I think we moved to a little village called Berryburg. They had a white school, and the colored school was closed. And the reason for that, there wasn't enough people, you know, really to open it. So the deal was, when we moved there, my father went to the Board of Education about opening up the school there so we'd have a place to go to school. And their argument was they wouldn't send both light and dark children together, or they wouldn't go together. And so they made an agreement with my dad, said if you would haul the children from Galloway area to Berryburg and put them in school, the dark ones from Berryburg to Galloway, and then bring the light ones from Galloway to Berryburg. And they had two segregated colored schools, two segregated colored schools. So they done that from, I think, 32 to 39. Well, the school was still open when we moved back to Ohio.
You mentioned in the other school when you lived in the city before in West Virginia that the light-colored kids couldn't attend school at the white school or the darker colored school. So what was the alternative for lighter-skinned people in regards to
There
school?
wasn't any. Their children weren't in school. I went to school. There was a couple of girls that was in their early 20s that had just started school after they started the light school at Berryburg. And very good for them. They ended up, both of them, coming out of school and being teachers.
So who taught at the school for colored children?
Well, our teachers up there were light-skinned people. And the one where the dark children went to, their teacher was a dark man.
So what was the community like of people of color in that area? Was it split along complexion lines or? Not really. They, you know, of course you know how children are. We all always played together. It didn't make any difference really. But they would not send them, the parents wouldn't send them to school together. So after West Virginia, where did your family move to and what school did you attend?
We come back to Zanesville. And I was 16 when I got married. I finished the 10th grade.
And did you ever go back to school?
No.
So after getting married, what did you do? Where did you live, and what was your occupation?
After my husband was out of service, we lived in Ohio for a while, but neither one of us could find good work there, so we moved to Michigan. And we moved to Lansing, Michigan, and both of us were able to get jobs in General Motors there. And we both were 30-year retirees from General Motors.
And what kind of work did you do at General?
We worked where they assembled cars. In the last 10 years, my husband was on supervision, and we worked at ended up going to a parts warehouse where they shipped out the parts for cars.
Can you tell me a little bit about your life here in Waterford, Ohio? where did you live here? What family members or Stevens were around this area when you were growing up? And how often, even when you moved away, did you come back to this area?
My grandfather's property butted to this 4-H club place just up the hill from here. And then he had a house still on up this Stevens Road that we lived in. We only lived here 1 year. And then we moved to West Virginia from here. And I was in the second grade when we lived here.
And what was your grandfather's name?
Jethro Stevens.
And how often would you come back to Waterford to visit?
Oh, we'd be back several times a year usually.
And when you were growing up, what were the family reunions like that you attended? What were the activities? How many people attended?
We had good attendance. I would say probably at least half or more of like we have now. There was always good attendance. And their activities were more, they would have like programs, were more religious type programs, and like the children would learn poems to say or to read, and some of the elderly would too, and they would have songs, and the guys used to pitch horseshoes. And really, that's basically all that I can remember, the activities that they had.
When and where was the family reunion held when you were growing
A
up?
lot of them were held at my grandfather's house just up the top of this hill. And then, the beginning was, I'll say before my time, was over to where my great-grandparents lived, not too far, well, I guess you'd call it across the field from where my grandfather lived. And it was there, and then it moved back, it moved to my grandfather's house. Then it used to be where Pearl Adams' house is. They used to have the reunions there on up Stevens Road.
Just going back, why did you not live in base housing? Was that available, or?
Live where?
Why did you not live on the base?
Well, most time the bases, before you could live there, I think you had to be a certain rank to live on base, like staff sergeant or higher than that.
And can you tell me a little bit about your grandfather, Jethro? What did he do? What kind of man was he? And did you know him personally growing up?
Yes, I knew him very well. He worked like with the wood sawmill type of work, and mostly though that I can remember, he was kind of semi-retired and farmed a lot. And I can remember he used to like to take us kids ride on the horses, or take us to the corn crib when he was getting ready to shell corn to take to have a flour made. He'd take us and let us, they had a hand grinder for the corn, and he'd let us help him do that. And he was a very nice man.
Now, can you tell me about some of the other, can you tell me, Jethro was married how many times? How many times was Jethro married?
Twice.
And who was his first wife?
His wife was Eliza Jane Dalton, and his second wife was Frances I think she had been married before. I think her name before was Frances Kennedy Mayo.
And what happened to Eliza Dalton?
She passed away in 1931.
And do you know under what circumstances?
I think it was a heart problem.
And so, how many kids did he have with his second wife?
None.
And
No.
how many kids did he have with his first wife?
7, I believe.
And your mother was?
Let's see. You want her name or which child?
Yeah, which child was your mother? Sorry.
Let's see. I think my mother was the third or fourth, a third, I believe, from the oldest.
And what, if any, did your mother tell you about her life growing up in Waterford, Ohio? What did she tell you, or stories she told you about growing up here?
Well, really not a whole lot, only like where they had to walk to school so far. And I don't recall of her saying anything about working out.
Tell me a little bit about the Stevens. Do you know how they came to Ohio and how they acquired the property that they owned in this area?
Now you've got me there. My daughter can tell you that story. She has looked it all up. But at one time, the Stevens owned a good percent of the property in this county, I guess, from what the papers that she has gathered.
Now, who are some of your other relatives that lived in the region when you were growing up that you would come back and see when you came to visit, who lived in the Waterford area?
Okay, my mother's youngest brother, Oscar, lived in the area, and then at one time her sister, Hilma, Hilma come back to help take care of Grandpa, and we would come back to visit them. And then my grandfather's brother Willie lived in the area, and we came back to visit them. And then my mother had 2 other brothers at one point in time. William and Lauren also lived in the area.
And do you know how most of the Stevens who lived in the area earned a living? How did they?
Well, the ones that lived here all the time, Uncle Oscar farmed, and Uncle Lauren went to Chicago area to work, and when he moved back from there, he farmed. So the ones that were in this area farming was what they done.
Now, was this area segregated or integrated when your family was living in the area?
It was more or less, I don't know, when we lived here everyone went to school together. But as I always say, it's been kind of segregated in a way.
How so?
Well, I don't know how to explain it really. Or maybe it was imagination, a lot of it.
As a kid, what were places that you couldn't go because you were a person of color, or things that you couldn't do here in this area?
I can't remember for sure whether the restaurants were segregated, because back then you really didn't go any place like that. But it really seems to me like the restaurants might have been segregated back then, but the schools weren't. You could go to school together.
Now, in an integrated school, were there ever incidents concerning people of color being treated differently, or?
I don't recall of having any problems.
How about movie theaters here?
Well, I don't recall going to any. In fact, I don't know whether there ever was any movie theaters here or not.
How about once you moved to Zanesville? Was
The yes, Zanesville was segregated.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
You had, if you went, I wasn't very much of a movie goer, but you had to sit in the balcony if you went to the movies in Zanesville. I can't remember what year they changed, but it was probably in the 40s, I would say, or maybe a little later.
And what movie theaters were in Zanesville?
There was the Liberty, the Weller, and the Quimby that I can remember right now.
Can you talk about other instances of segregation in Zanesville that you remember when you lived there?
I don't know. You know, I really personally have never had a whole lot of trouble myself. Like I laugh and tell my husband a lot of times, I think boys had more trouble than girls did.
Why do you say that?
Well, I don't know. I just hear him talking, you know, like how the boys didn't get along and they was fighting and calling names and what have you. And I don't know. It just seemed like I never had that problem.
How about roller skating?
Well, number one, I wasn't allowed to go roller skating, but their roller skating in Zanesville was segregated. You had, I think, one night a week that you could go.
And why weren't you allowed to roller skate?
My mother and father wouldn't let me go to the skating rinks.
Was there a reason?
Well, they figured it would be too much trouble to get into, I guess.
Going back to people in your family, can you tell me about Ann Stevens? She married a man named Cumberland Posey.
That's back long before my time, I think.
So how long did you live in Zanesville?
I lived in Zanesville except what did I say, from 31 to 39 we lived here in 31 to 32 and we moved to West Virginia about 5 years. So I've lived in Zanesville until we moved to Michigan in 46.
Can you tell me about the community center in Zanesville? If you attended, what type of activities they offered?
I didn't go that much there, but they had different, you know, like ball for the kids to play, and I really don't know too much what they did offer because my parents, you know, I wasn't allowed to go too many places.
Was the community center segregated, or what?
Yeah, the community center was for the colored.
And where was it located?
On 6th Street, South 6th Street.
Growing up, what types of food did you eat, and was most of the food that you ate purchased or grown?
Both. My mother done some canning, like her green beans and tomatoes, pickles, things. She canned a lot of that. But they bought most from the store. And then sometimes they'd have a small garden, you know, for fresh peppers or radishes and things like that.
How about meat?
Well, they bought most of their meat at the store. Once in a while, they would buy like a part of a beef or pork and would can that.
How did those things taste?
Good. Those were good. We often talk about that, you know. The canned meats were canned kind of like with a gravy, or a lot of broth. And if someone come in, you know how it is with the freezer, it's always frozen, but that you could open up a can of pork or beef and make you some gravy and fry, or like cooked potatoes and a vegetable, and you had your meal.
Now, where did you live in Zanesville?
on Vine Street.
And how about electricity in that house?
It was all modern, all the, electric and bath and everything there.
And growing up, how about clothing? Was it purchased or made? And if it was purchased, where did you shop for clothing growing up?
Well, I had some, mother made some and bought some, but a lot of times she'd do her shopping at Penny's.
Growing up, what types of jobs did you held? You mentioned some of them, but if you can just mention them again, and how old were you when you got your first job?
Oh, I probably was maybe 14. I used to help, well, in fact, one of my cousins owned a fruit market, but I used to work at a fruit market on West Main Street. And then I used to do some house cleaning. I didn't do too much of that, but for a while, like I'd be able to get out of school early in the afternoon, say maybe 2 o'clock, and go work for a couple, 3 hours, and then maybe a half a day on Saturday.
And what did you do with the money that you made at these jobs? Where would you go?
Well, I could have whatever I made, I didn't have to do any special thing with it. But I usually would use it like if there was some line of clothing that I wanted, or, to spend for that.
Now, how were job opportunities different for people of color when you were growing up?
Well, there really wasn't a whole lot of things. Like most jobs were domestic work of some type, or like if you worked in the stores or something, most of the time it was cleaning or something like that.
And you mentioned one of your relatives owned a fruit stand.
Mm-hmm.
Where was that, and what were their names?
Bernard and Letha Tibbs, and the fruit market was on West Main Street at Zanesville.
And do you know how they came to run a fruit market, and how were they related to you?
She was my second cousin.
And how did they get involved in the fruit stand?
I was sort of sitting here trying to think. I don't remember how come them to start in that business. Seems to me like maybe he had worked with one of the people that owned the fruit market with before, and he ended up buying the market.
Now, what were some of the other black-owned or people of color-owned businesses in Zanesville when you were growing up there, living there?
Ooh, I can't think of too many right now. I don't know, as thinking offhand, I don't even recall a restaurant that was owned by blacks. Mostly would be someone that had a trucking business, or that type of work.
Growing up, what religion were family members? What churches did they attend?
Okay, we're Methodists, and went to State Street Westland Methodist Church is where we went.
How often did you attend church growing up?
Just about every Sunday, and sometimes midweek.
And what were some of the activities associated with attending church?
Well, not too much, other than, like our choir practice, and now and then getting ready for different programs they would have, and once in a while maybe some picnics or something like that.
What was the role of the church for the people of color in the Zanesville community?
Well, I don't know.
How did religion influence behavior? Did it influence activities that you could do, how you dressed, and that kind of stuff? And how did it influence those things?
Well, you wore, maybe I'll say you wore a little more clothes than they wear today when we went. And like I say, dressed maybe a little more respectable than they do now. Or what my parents, at least at that time, called respectable.
And what was that, to be respectable?
Well, like you didn't wear like your dresses too short, or like they didn't go too much for shorter sleeves, and just kind of, I call little simple things these days. And no shorts. I don't think I wore a pair of shorts till after I was married.
How about pants?
Pants weren't really popular then. Like if we were going out to pick berries or something like that, we'd slip on a pair of brother's pants or something, but no slacks then.
So what was the dress like when you were coming up?
It was mostly just dresses and skirts and blouses. And usually length, below the knee.
Growing up, what types of things could you do for fun, or did you do for fun?
Well, our biggest activity was gone to church. Like when I was in school, I could go to ball games. If it was in the daytime, I wasn't allowed to go to no night games. Then there just really was no, and I could go to the picture show, but I wasn't really a movie fan that much. I didn't care that much about them. And then we just would visit with our girlfriends.
And what would you do when you visited with people?
Just sit around, talk, or play game, like some kind of games, Old Maid, or actually, I can't think now what we did do on the games so much.
You were talking about, when were you born again?
1926.
So can you talk about a little bit about what it was like to grow up during the Depression?
To be truthful, I hear people talking about the Depression, and I don't remember. I guess my dad was fortunate enough to have enough work that as a child, I didn't realize there was a depression. But I'm quite sure they must have had a hard time, but we never knew it.
And during the war, your husband was in the military, but how were you affected? Like, did you have rationing, or what kind of things do you remember? If you could tell us a little bit about what it was like.
There was a few things that was rationed, like sugar and the gasoline. It was hard to get nylons, and let's see what else was, I can't think now what else was there.
Why was your husband never employed overseas?
Well, one thing about the time that they thought about sending him overseas, or his company going overseas, they found he had a slight back problem, and so he didn't have to go overseas.
And so what did he do in the Air Force?
He worked in an office a good % of the time.
And doing?
Well, like I can remember the last year, or maybe year and a half, he was in rail transportation, like doing the flights, the tickets for the guys when they was going home, or when they had to be transferred from one place to the other.
Growing up, how did you learn about slavery?
Really, we didn't have a whole lot in school like they do now, about slavery. Not a whole, we had some, but not a whole lot.
What did they tell you, if anything?
Just mostly, that you couldn't do this or that, or go in here or there after you left Ohio, or south of you know, the Ohio River maybe.
What are the stories in your family, if any, about slavery, about, your ancestors being enslaved or how they gained their freedom?
As far back as I know, there was none of our parents that were or none of our family that was in slavery.
Do you know how they gained their freedom, and
No, I don't.
what brought them to Ohio? And what year did they come to Ohio?
I'm not sure. It's a shame that I don't know, because my daughter is the one that's all in the genealogy. Now when I want to know something, I ask her.
Why do you think it wasn't talked about in the family growing up?
I have no idea.
What kinds of stories would you hear growing up about your family?
Well, I don't know, we were just a plain, everyday family, I guess. I can't think of anything special that, because everybody just went to work and come home was about the biggest part of it.
How about the Underground Railroad? What did you hear about the Underground Railroad growing up?
And I didn't have much of that when I was growing up. I've heard more about it lately than, of course, maybe at that point I just didn't show too much interest in it.
You mentioned Stevens Road in Waterford, Ohio being a place where people of color lived. Where were some other settlements that people of color resided in this area when you were growing up, or even prior to you growing up, that you knew about in this region?
Well, I don't know how far, there was people of color a lot in, around Marietta area, and, well, I don't think there was a whole lot in Stockport, but it seems to me that's where my grandfather was born. I really don't know too much about the area on that.
You mentioned that you moved to Michigan. When did you move to Michigan, and what brought you? Why did you move to Michigan?
Looking for work. My husband, had been where his father had lived up here, different times. Work seemed to be better staying up here. In Michigan seemed like more work there than here in Ohio. Because we seemed like you never could find anything around Zanesville to work, but we ended up both getting in, like I say, General Motors up there, and so we just stayed.
How was life different in Michigan than in Ohio?
Not really a whole lot different.
What was the racial climate like in Michigan?
Pretty much the same as here.
Was it segregated or integrated where you lived in Michigan?
Well, at the time we went there, the schools, were integrated. But still they had their little problems, now like they do most every place.
When did you hear about the Civil Rights Movement, and what did you think of it, and how did you learn about the Civil Rights Movement, and did it affect your own life to any degree?
No, it didn't affect my own life to any degree, but what you read in the paper on the news is where where I heard about that.
Now, what did you think about what was going on?
Well, it wasn't right what had been done, but it was always, I figured it was always a bad situation, things that were done, to people of color because they were trying to make a good living for themselves or make life better for us.
You've mentioned that a lot of your people were of a light complexion. Are there incidents, or what are the incidents of people passing as white? Did you ever pass as white, and for what purposes and different things like that? Do you know of anybody in your family that did pass?
I can't just offhand think, I can't name any particular person right now, but there probably has been, you know, people that have gone like to get jobs or something that have passed.
Why do you think more of the people of color here didn't pass in order to gain advantages or, you know, make their lives easier? What do you think? Why, do you have any thoughts on why people didn't choose to pass?
Well, I don't know. I think most people wanted to be what they were, and, you know, they made the best of the situation.
Growing up, what were some of the illnesses that family members experienced or had when you were growing up?
I can't think of any, you know, thing other than normal colds and heart problems and, you know, things like that.
How were those illnesses treated? If you had a cold or a flu, what was done? What were some home remedies? When did you see the doctor?
Well, it depends, I guess, how bad the cold was that you would go, but usually they would, like one thing was, you usually got some kind of a laxative for one thing. And usually cough medicine, maybe they would mix up some like honey and garlic and lemon juice. That was always good for a cough, and I still use it.
What types of laxatives were they using for?
Well, back then they used to use a lot of castor oil.
And in what type of instances would you see the doctor, and who was the doctor that you saw? Where was he located? Did he come to the home, or did you go to his doctor office? Was he a person of color?
No, the doctor that we had here in Zanesville was, well, when I was younger, was a white doctor. Then later, at that point, there wasn't any color doctors in town, but later in years, we had, I think, about 3 different color doctors in town that we used to go to.
And what years was this at the?
That would have been in the 40s, I believe, late 30s or 40s.
What are some ailments or diseases that people suffer from in your family now? Is there diabetes?
Mostly that I can think of is either heart or diabetes.
And what do you think accounts for that in the families? Do you think it's hereditary, diet?
I don't know. I think sometimes it's hereditary, and could be possible diet.
You mentioned your husband was a Goins. Now, there's a lot of Goins in southeastern Ohio. How is he related to those Goins?
Oh, there's a lot of them. We haven't, I'm sure we're probably related someplace, but we haven't connected, you know. There's very few that we have connected to as being related.
So was your husband, he's from Michigan. He's born in Michigan.
He was born in Michigan.
Where were his parents born?
One I think was born in Ohio, and one I think in West Virginia. They weren't natives of, you know, of Michigan. It's just that they had moved there, you know, for work.
What do you know about the Adams side of your family? Do you know where they're from?
I'm not sure where my grandmother was from, but my grandfather was from over around Gertie, West Virginia.
And what was his name?
James Adams.
Is there anything else you could tell me about your family history that you think is important that I haven't asked you?
No, nothing that I really can think of right now.
Is there anything that you'd like to add to the interview, or anything that you've thought of that you think is important? Do you know about your family's involvement in the Civil War?
Mm-mm.
Did your grandfather, do you know if he was involved in?
I don't think so. I've never heard of any of the family that I know of. I'm sure there probably was, but I don't know of any.
Okay, well, I guess that's it. I hope it's been painless for you.
Oh, it's okay.